June 4th, 1942, Midway. The first hint that they were in real trouble wasn't a radar blip. It was the sky turning into a swarm. 12 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers drummed toward the Japanese fleet at barely 100 knots, low over a steel-blue Pacific. Above and behind them, 4 F4F Wildcats and their commander, Lieutenant Commander John Jimmie Thach, try to look like more than a handful of fighters. Thach glances back. The horizon is moving, tiny specks that grow into a cloud. Mitsubishi A6M Zeros angling down from altitude like pale knives. Everyone in those cockpits knows the math. The Devastators are crawling targets. The Wildcats are tough but slower and less agile than Zeros. And there are far too many enemy fighters. Thach's voice cuts through the rising tension. Stay with your wingmen. Blue section, prepare to weave. Most of his pilots have practiced this maneuver in training. Never in a sky full of enemy fighters. If it works, any Zero that chases one Wildcat will fly straight into another's guns. If it fails, 4 Wildcats will die in front of the bombers they're supposed to protect. The first Zeros hit like thrown spears, diving, spraying tracers, climbing back up. A Devastator explodes into spray and fire, another trails smoke. Thach doesn't chase, he calls his move. Dib, turn in, weave now. 2 Wildcats bank toward each other on a collision course-looking path. A Zero locks onto Thach's wingman and follows him into the turn, guns flickering. The pattern Thach sketched months earlier on a kitchen table with matchsticks is about to be tested at 10,000 feet with lives on the line. Because this didn't start over Midway. It started in California, with a worried squadron commander staring at performance charts and asking, "How do you beat an enemy you can't outrun or outturn?" Some dialogue is dramatized, but the situation, Wildcats escorting Devastators into a sky full of Zeros at Midway, and Thach using his weave, is drawn from historical accounts. Long before Midway, the problem sat in Thach's briefing files. On one side, the Grumman F4F Wildcat. It isn't pretty, barrel fuselage, thick wings, but it's tough. It has armor behind the pilot, self-sealing fuel tanks, and a reputation for getting home full of holes. Mechanics call it built like a truck, and pilots quietly agree. But trucks aren't sprinters. On the other side, the Mitsubishi A6M Zero. Light, graceful, stripped of armor and self-sealing tanks to save weight. It's fragile when hit, but until someone hits it, it climbs and turns like nothing else in the sky. By late 1941, reports from China and early Pacific encounters pile up. The Japanese fighter outclimbs us, it outturns us. Try to dogfight it like we trained, and it's on your tail in seconds. Those reports land on the desk of squadron commanders like Thach. He's no movie star ace yet, but he's a sharp tactician and gunnery expert. He commands VF-3, a frontline Navy fighter squadron. His pilots shoot well on the range, but he understands. Perfect aim doesn't matter if you never get a firing opportunity. On paper, the Zero beats the Wildcat in climb, turn radius, and low-speed handling. The Wildcat's advantages are fewer but important. It's rugged, and its .50 caliber guns hit hard when they connect. The problem is living long enough to make those guns matter. Pilots returning from early fights report the same pattern. Get into a turning contest with a Zero, and it simply floats past your canopy, cuts the corner, slides onto your tail. Try to climb away, and it follows. Slow down to turn tighter, and you become a lumbering target. Designing a new fighter would take years the Navy doesn't have. The factories are already maxed just producing Wildcats. For the crucial early years of the war, the Wildcat is what the Navy has. So Thach changes the question. Instead of, how do we beat the Zero with a better airplane? He asks, how do we beat the Zero with better tactics? He doesn't need one Wildcat to outperform a Zero. He needs two Wildcats together to become something a Zero can't safely attack. Before Thach dumps those matchsticks on his table, other pilots try to fight the old way and pay for it. Pre-war doctrine teaches neat three-plane divisions, tight formations, and classic dogfights. See the enemy, turn with him, try to get inside his circle. That works fine over peacetime airfields. Then they meet the Zero. Off Wake Island, Marine pilots watch Zeros carve through their formations. In early carrier battles, Wildcats dive on bombers, then find themselves dragged into low-altitude turning fights they cannot win. Some escape only by diving away and trusting their toughness. Many don't escape at all. Debriefings start to sound like eulogies with diagrams. How'd he go down? Turned with a Zero. Never got out. New pilots hear bitter advice over coffee in ready rooms. Don't get slow with them. If one's on your tail, dive, don't turn. But in combat, fear goes straight through logic. When tracers reach for you, instinct says, yank the stick and turn as hard as you can. Against a Zero, that instinct is deadly. Thach studies report after report. He sees the Zero dominating turning fights. He also notices small cracks in the myth. Zeros that are forced to break off when a second Wildcat shows up. Enemy pilots who tunnel vision on one target and follow too long. Moments when teamwork, not solo heroics, saves a crew. The Wildcat isn't useless. American pilots are just flying it as if they're alone. Thach decides that has to change. Some specific debrief scenes are composites, but the overall pattern, early turning fights, high losses, growing respect for the Zero, is rooted in wartime accounts. Thach goes home, spreads combat reports on a small table in his Coronado quarters, opens a box of matches and starts pushing sticks around. In his hands, the matches become airplanes. Two parallel sticks, Wildcats, a third behind them, a Zero. He traces the standard scenario. The Zero dives from above, pulls onto a Wildcat's tail. The Wildcat tries to turn away. The Zero simply cuts inside and ends up in the killing position. He resets the sticks and asks, what if we're not alone? This time, two Wildcat sticks fly on a loose beam, side by side instead of stacked. The Zero picks one as its target and slides onto its tail. But when the Zero fires, Thach doesn't move the target away. He moves both Wildcats toward each other. The two friendly sticks turn in, crossing paths. The Zero, glued to one Wildcat, slides across the nose of the other. He runs it again. If the Zero chases one Wildcat stubbornly, the other always gets a shot. On a tabletop, it's simple. Two slower fighters cover each other's tails by turning toward, not away. Any enemy who commits to one is dragged into the guns of the other. He calls it the beam defense position. Others will later give it the name everyone remembers, the Thach weave. Now he has to prove it in the air. Back at VF3, he briefs the squadron. They'll fly mock fights, two Wildcats as defenders, two as attackers pretending to be Zeros. To stress test the idea, he has the defenders throttle limited so they can't use full power. The attackers, led by hotshot Ensign Edward Butch O'Hare, get to run in faster. Up in clear California sky, they try it. Every time O'Hare chases one Wildcat's tail, that pilot turns in toward his wingman. The other Wildcat turns opposite. At the crossing point, just like with the matches, O'Hare ends up flying into the other Wildcat's gun envelope. After landing, the story goes, O'Hare shakes his head and tells Thach, "Skipper, I couldn't make a pass without one of you looking right at me. The toothpicks work. The question is whether they'll still work when the bullets are real." Over Midway, the Japanese fleet looks almost neat from Thach's cockpit. Ordered wakes, gray ships, a pattern of targets. Then flak flowers around the Devastators and the Zeros rise. Zeros slash through the torpedo bombers, tearing into their slow, poorly protected formation. One Wildcat is caught out of position and goes down. Another is driven low and away. In practice, 4 fighters are all that stand between the Devastators and a sky full of attackers. Thach sees more Zeros forming up, a dozen or more, possibly closer to 20. On paper, this is where the Wildcats die. Instead, Thach's voice stays measured. "Dib, turn in, weave, now." He and Ensign ram. Dib form the core of the pattern. When a Zero commits to Dib's tail, Dib resists the urge to break away alone. He turns toward Thach, trusting the briefing more than his gut. Thach dives under him and banks hard. They cross so close Thach can see panel lines on Dib's Wildcat, and behind him, the pale shape of the Zero lining up its shot. Then the geometry snaps into place. As they cross, the Zero chasing Dib slides straight into Thach's gun sight. Thach fires. Tracers walk up the Zero's nose, into its engine. It bursts into flame and falls away. They repeat the pattern. Another Zero dives on Thach. Now he's the bait, turning in even as every instinct screams to jink away. Dib swings through the opposite arc. The Zero that stays glued to Thach again finds itself in Dib's sights. Another one down. Around them, the Devastators are being slaughtered. Of 12, only a couple will limp away. The torpedo attack fails. In the grand story of Midway, VT-3's run is a tragedy that helps set up later victories by other squadrons. But in that chaos, something crucial is proven. 4 Wildcats, outnumbered as much as 5-1, survive a fight they arguably shouldn't. Thach is credited with 3 Zeros that morning, his men with at least 1 more. Most of the Wildcats make it back. Thach later admits it was indeed surprising that any of our pilots returned alive. The Wildcat hadn't magically become a better airplane. The matchstick idea had simply held up under real fire. News travels fast in fighter circles. Pilots who've flown with Thach or trained under him talk in ready rooms and wardrooms about how 4 Wildcats used a crazy crossing thing to punch out of a Zero swarm over Midway. The Navy notices. Thach is increasingly pulled into a wider role. He still flies, but more and more he's used as a tactician and teacher. Squadrons rotating through get chalkboard diagrams of crossing arcs, then hours of practice turning the weave into reflex. Out in the Solomons, at the rough strip called Henderson Field, Marine and Navy pilots adopt it fast. Their mixed force of Wildcats, Dauntlesses, and other aircraft becomes the Cactus Air Force. Japanese bombers and Zeros attack almost daily, trying to crush the Guadalcanal foothold. The Americans are outnumbered and exhausted. They can't afford bad trades. So the Wildcats start weaving. 2-plane sections fly side by side. 4-plane divisions split into supporting pairs. Zeros dive in expecting another easy turning fight, and instead find that every time they settle behind one Wildcat, another swings in from the side with guns already tracking. Japanese ace Saburo Sakai later writes about how tough Wildcats are, soaking up damage and staying in the fight. Less visibly, his side is discovering that American fighters are no longer flying like lone wolves. They're dragging Zeros through overlapping cones of fire instead of peeling off one by one. Other leaders, like Lieutenant Commander James Flatley, adapt the weave at battles such as Santa Cruz, using crossing Wildcats to spoil Zero attacks again and again. The Wildcat itself never gets faster. But as more units learn the weave, study captured Zeros, and adopt new tactics, the kill ratios shift. What looked like a hopeless mismatch becomes a grinding contest where discipline and teamwork can beat elegance and agility. Underneath the new briefing charts, the idea is still the same. Two little sticks on a table, turning toward each other, daring a third to make a fatal choice. After Midway, Thach's personal war doesn't get easier, but his influence spreads. The Navy has learned it can't afford to lose its best tacticians to one lucky enemy burst. Thach moves up the chain into staff and command roles, but his thinking stays rooted in the same logic. Don't fight on the enemy's terms. When kamikaze attacks begin turning the seas around Japan into killing zones, Thach helps design what becomes known as the Big Blue Blanket, layers of radar picket ships, early fighter patrols, and aggressive sweeps over enemy airfields. It's the same mindset as the weave, scaled up. Cover each other, control the geometry, and deny the enemy a clean run. He eventually becomes an admiral and finishes his career as Commander, U.S. Naval Forces Europe. To most people, he's a senior officer with rows of ribbons. To many fighter pilots, he's always the man who refused to accept that the Zero was unbeatable, and who went home one night, spilled matches on a table, and stayed there until he'd found a way to bring more of his men home. Because the Thach weave was never really about clever aerobatics, it was about making sure someone was always watching your tail. On maps, Midway is usually told with big arrows and carrier names in bold. Somewhere beneath those arrows, there's a kitchen table in Coronado, a handful of matchsticks, and a commander who refused to let "we can't outturn them" be the end of the conversation. The Thach weave didn't turn Wildcats into super fighters. It did something subtler. It gave outgunned pilots a plan. It turned teamwork and timing into survival and helped move the air war from despair toward dominance. Stories like this are built on real events and records, even if some cockpit dialogue is dramatized to bring them to life. For deep research, always go to professional historians and primary sources. If you want more forgotten World War II stories like this, tactics sketched on notepads, fixes made in hangars, underdog crews who refuse to quit, hit like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from and which Pacific Air War stories you want next. Sometimes, the smallest ideas, like a toothpick trick on a kitchen table, are the ones that bring pilots home.